Gentlemen, thanks for jumping on. I love doing the lunch and learns, and I think that one of the coolest part about it is just to be able to sort of meet new people and sort of talk through some of these concepts. Um, what this one's about today, breaking through limits to growth. So we had a quick chat sort of about like some of the things that we're working on and some of the challenges that you might have, which I'm keen to get into at the end. This will just be a sort of a short presentation and give us a bit of time to chat at the end there, but what we're talking about today. So we're going to go through a few bits and pieces. Firstly, the science of growth. So what do we know about growing kind of in general, and what sort of lessons can we apply to businesses? Talking about sort of evolving our businesses. So when we get stuck, what can we think about in terms of evolving those things? And we're taking through 4 limits to growth for companies. These are fairly broad. Obviously, my background is around sort of technology and software, but I think a lot of the concepts are very sort of more widely applicable. And then some Q&A and discussion towards the end, which is the fun bit. But if you're ready, what I might do is take you through maybe a quick history lesson. I don't know if anyone here is a history buff at all. This is a good friend, Anthony here, and he made a very important discovery in 1683. Quite a very specific fact, but I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab of what he might be looking through his microscope at. That's okay. I wouldn't know this either unless I had Wikipedia'd it over the last week. So Anthony discovered bacteria in 1683. So that he was to his legacy, he discovered a lot of things, but created over, I think, 500 different types of lenses, 25 different types of microscopes. So it's really been sort of 1683 onwards that we've been had this idea of bacteria, and bacteria have really been an interesting thing to study over that time, because if you want to see about how groups of organisms kind of grow together, it's very easy to study them. You put them in a petri dish and you watch how they grow. Much harder to study how groups of lions or elephants kind of come together. You need a lot of space and a lot of protection from the lions. So I guess since that time, scientists have been studying growth. How do things grow together? And when they do these experiments, they produce this chart, which I think is something a lot of us have sort of seen before. This concept of exponential growth. So in this chart, essentially, you've got down the bottom time. So imagine you've got a little dish with some sugar solution in it. You put some bacteria in there. At the first, there's just that original culture. So you don't have any growth. But eventually they start sort of working their magic, and they're splitting and doubling and growing exponentially along this line here. And if the petri dish was sort of an infinite amount of infinitely large, and there was infinite amount of nutrients and all the rest of it in there, they'd go on growing forever. But of course, at a certain stage, we hit some sort of limit to growth, and that's when they start entering a phase here, and then there's sort of a downslope from there. And this is a logarithmic graph, so any straight lines that you see are sort of exponential curves going up. This is clearly not a talk today about bacteria, but it's an interesting sort of anecdote to think about in terms of how we think about it. So the scientists have sort of talked about these 4 stages. So you've got this lag phase at the start. So that's essentially where the bacteria are sort of adapting themselves to the environment. They're getting ready. They're finding out where the nutrients are. You've got an exponential phase where they're doubling and they're growing, and that's when they're going along that theoretical growth line there. Stationary phase. So that's when they've hit one of those limits to growth. So for bacteria, that's things like nutrients, waste, the environment that they're in. Maybe it's gotten too hot or too cold. But eventually, if these limiting factors that we have go on for too long, bacteria enter this death phase, which is essentially where they start to die off. And eventually, if it gets so bad that you end up with no bacteria at all. So I think we fairly well understand this from a bacterial perspective. But if we make the jump over to applying this sort of model to businesses, I think a lot of these things hold up. like the first one clearly is, this theoretical growth line. I think when we're all starting businesses or people are investing businesses, people talk about total addressable market, or they talk about all the people, all the things that we could sell to. There's kind of this idea that we're going to have infinite growth, or at least growing up to this level. But of course, we hit one. So in this you can think about, when you're either you're starting a business from scratch, or you're doing anything new or interesting, trying to grow out of it. You'll have this lag phase. So this is where the company is sort of setting the strategy. You're investing, might be hiring people, building a product. You'll have this exponential phase, which is, revenue's increasing. You take that revenue, you reinvest it back into the team, or into building the product, or finishing the business in some way. But at a certain point, as happens with every business and every business model, growth will stall, and that will become down to one of the limiting factors in there, which is one of the things I want to unpack for you. And of course, like bacteria, if we're not able to sort of evolve out of that model, the company begins to die or to go backwards, and that's sort of what we're calling the death phase there. So yes, thanks for obliging me with my bacterial introduction. But I thought that was a good way to sort of segment and sort of move into this sort of introduction around some of the 4 limiting factors to business growth. Of course, there's many of them, but this is really sort of 4 of the main ones that I can see. And that's basically talent. So your team, who are your team? Who's on the front line dealing with customers? Who have you got in management helping you with that? Financing. So how are you paying the bills? How are customers paying you? What sort of financial instruments are you using to fund your growth? Sales, clearly probably one of the most obvious ones, for bringing new sales in or not, and keeping existing customers coming back. And the product. So I use product here as a generic term to talk about what it is we're selling. So that can be a piece of technology, that can be a consulting solution. In case of you, Tom, that's everything you're doing with the club and all the rest of it. So that's that. So what I'll do now is I'll just unpack, I guess, some of the limiting factors that I see in each of these areas, and then sort of work through sort of how they really put the brakes on and stop you from growing. So if we start with talent, so that's your first limiting factor there, and one that I think we don't often think about as we're growing. And essentially what that looks like is, say we're growing, we've kind of got, say we want to do anything new, we need to bring new people into the business. One of the big things that people really struggle with is this sort of talent pipeline piece of it. So, how long does it take us to bring, new people into the business? How do we find them? What's the mix of talent? Are we having like good people applying or not? Getting that wrong, actually has a run-on effect kind of in the business going forward. But then, when we get, say we've gone through a hiring round, are we investing in the team that we've got, and are we investing at the right level? So if we're bringing junior staff on, do we have a way for them to progress through the business and learn the skills that they need to learn, or sort of grow with the company? And if we're getting that wrong, that can be a massive limiting factor as well. And then sort of both of those factors tend to lead to this third part, which is the staff retention piece, which is basically, if you've if we're not sort of giving people a compelling reason to stay, that might be sort of a compensation package, or it might be them being aligned to the company, or maybe we haven't made the right hiring decisions in the first place. We'll start having issues with staff retention, and that can be devastating. If 50% of your staff are not working out, you've wasted all of that time training them, and they're not able to sort of progress with the business there. So talent becomes a really massive thing to think about kind of as you're growing, and it could be an area where you might have stalled. I mean, clearly with coronavirus, that's probably one of the big things that a lot of businesses are struggling with at the moment. And we'll go through some things that you can think about for that. But I might just stop at this point and just make sure you can hear me okay. All of this is making sense. You can just thumbs up if it's, yep, awesome. Let me know if you're falling asleep as well. So the second bit, I'm gonna go through each of these limiting factors, and then I'm gonna have a bit of a chat about them. Finance is your next one, clearly. So how are we able to pay the bills? how we're sort of thinking about funding the company. This can be a really tricky one, and I think some of the common things that we see over here are these three elements. So first one is sort of around the cash flow and the forecasting side of it. And this is kind of, it doesn't matter how you're funded, whether you're sort of bootstrapped, like you're funded exclusively from customers, you've got loans or, some debt from the bank, or, sort of a more of a venture capital type arrangement. Cash flow and the forecasting bit is crucial, because if we have all these plans, like we want to grow the team, we might want to open another site, we want to invest in the company in some way, we need to understand, do we have the cash on hand to do that over the long term? And a lot of people either fail to do this, or they make a plan that's so tight, has so little wriggle room in it, that they're finding they're having to really aggressively cut back on spending to avoid hitting that $0 cash balance in there, or really running up overruns. So that's so yeah, getting better in that side is important. The second one is just this difficulty around measuring ROI, and specifically like measuring what it is. Is it good? What do we want to be spending money on here? And I think one of the issues with this is that a lot of the things that we spend time and effort on in a business pay off over different time periods. So around sales and around other things, they have a very tight payback period. So if we invest in sales and marketing, hopefully we should see a return pretty quickly. But if we're developing our team, or we're developing product, or making refurbishments to a building or something like that, those pay back over a longer time, and it's hard to judge sometimes, is it good to spend money on them now or otherwise. And then finally, just this cash cycle. And I think, again, this is really important. As we're growing, the quicker that we can get money from our customers, is the quicker that we can then spend it on something that's worthwhile spending it on. And we find often as businesses get larger, it takes longer to get money from customers, or or more demands from suppliers. And then also we tend to sort of build up this bureaucracy or sort of stickiness inside this company, where we're controlling what people can spend, and it makes it harder for frontline managers who we would otherwise trust to spend petty cash, or even just small amounts on things that would really improve the business. So it's important, I think, around there to sort of understand how these things can be a bit of a handbrake to growth, especially as we're kind of going up that exponential curve, to put more trust in the team, and to get better at sort of picking the winners and forecasting. So that's the finance side. Finance and talent are probably the two inputs here that we think about the least. And then in terms of kind of more things that are closer to home, sales is probably your third limiting factor. And on this part, this is like I haven't talked about here individual salespeople, so I talked about more these global factors that impact sales. So one of them is sort of weak, I'm calling demand generation, which is are people banging down your door trying to buy whatever it is that you're selling? So are we doing the marketing right? Are we having these conversations that we need to be having with potential buyers? Are we sort of being top of mind? That if that doesn't sort of keep pace with where we want to grow, or it breaks down for some reason, that can be a massive limiting factor here. Then the other two are, and I would say it's probably the most obvious one, but the other two are probably the less obvious. And a big one is sort of confusion over this target market. So who are we selling to? Who are the types of people that we should be having these conversations with? And that can change over time. We could decide to be selling up or down market, or we could be selling in a new area. Sort of steering away from that and not having absolute sort of lightning kind of clarity over that is very dangerous. And the third one, which always frustrates people, is sort of competitors. Competitors popping up. There'll always be competitors. If you're not competing with anyone and you can't name a competitor, then you're competing against the status quo, which is the price of inaction. And positioning against that is very important. So as markets become more competitive, or or even change a lot, it's important to know what you do really well, what your competitors do really well, and position against that. That way, when you're thinking about your product, you don't have to build everything for everyone, and you can put money in the right place for that as well. So that's limiting factors on the sales side. And then the final one is around product. So again, this is a sort of pretty generic term that I'm using sort of to describe this. And we develop products in lots of different ways. But the three, I think, clearest ones there is around product market fit. So that's sort of a software term, but essentially that means, does when people buy our product, does it do what it says on the tin? When people sort of come away from that, do they feel, that they've got what they paid for, that they're raving about it to their friends? And when you start the business, like, clearly product market fit is something you have to find, but it also ebbs and flows as the market changes as well. So a product or a business that may have been performing quite well in a certain space at a time, it may have had a really good product market fit, but that's gone away, and we need to think about how we can recapture that and sort of re-energize the business in that space. The second one is around underinvestment or sort of lack of innovation. It's sort of a cruel fact that it's just becoming easier and easier to start businesses in a lot of spaces now, like particularly with technology and as things are increasing. People that start a business today are going to have a natural advantage over someone who started a business 5-10 years ago even. So that means we need to stay ahead of the curve. We need to understand, what the trends are, sort of innovate in those areas, and making sure that we're actually able to invest in the business and what we're selling, so that we're able to sort of stay ahead of that. So that's the second one. And then the third one is really around your product and how it scales. So if we're talking about growth, we're potentially talking about doing more of what it is that we do and what it is we're best at. We find often products do really well at a certain level, maybe to a certain type of customer in a certain area or with a certain size. But as we want to scale that and bring more people in there, how does a product perform? And what tends to happen is that products are adapted to a certain market, and then as they grow up, then they need to adapt. So we need to invest in them. If they fail to scale, then the whole thing sort of falls down. And it's worth mentioning as well, like, the way that all of these elements feed back on each other. I mean, clearly, if you don't have a good product market fit, if people are buying what it is that you're selling, but it's not delivering value to them, no amount of finance, talent, or sales can really help you with this problem. So it's really important to be able to sort of map where the specific areas that we're sort of lagging in are, and fixing those, and that will really help the whole organization from there. So painted a bit of I would say a sad picture of all of the different limits that you might hit, and there might be other ones as well. But I wanted to talk from here about sort of evolving the business model. So as I mentioned before, there's natural limits to everything. We don't live in an infinitely large petri dish or an infinitely large market, and there's lots of competition and all sorts of things, and the environment changes. So it's important to think about, okay, when those limits come up, how do we think about them, and how do we evolve out of them? And maybe just a quick sort of visual anecdote for what I mean by that. If we look back at our beloved bacteria chart here, we can see that we always think along this line here. No one wants to be in a position where growth slows and sort of bottoms out, but it happens at a certain point because of some limit. And as I mentioned before, if we don't do something about that, we start sliding back down the other way. So what we really want to do is understand, okay, we're going to hit a growth limit at some point. That's completely natural. But then how do we kind of evolve this so that we're able to sort of keep growing in the direction that we want? And the way that works is this sort of evolution. Just to use an example here, say you're starting a business. It could be in any industry. You start it yourself and you're the founder, and you want to grow. So in phase one, you're going to hire, let's say, sales or support or product or kitchen staff or whoever it is to sort of do some of your role. You're going to hire them, and you're going to invest, and you're going to make them successful. So we start in this lag phase. So we bring those people, and we invest the money, and we do everything we need to do, and then we start seeing success. So it starts working up to the point where it doesn't. Maybe there's too many people who are reporting to you, or we don't have enough cash to fund new hires or something like that. What we need to do then is like do something that kind of evolves us out of that paradigm. And in this case, you go from having yourself with a couple of people who are reporting to you to building out functional teams. So breaking those down. So say you've got a sales team and a product team rather than all just being in one team. And you build out those functional teams, with leadership that can carry them forward. So you're no longer the bottleneck there. And then we start growing again, and it takes some time to adjust, but we sort of chain these phases, and we come up here, and then we hit another flag. Again, this could be the product's not sustaining enough, or we're not, like, the sales aren't supporting us for whatever reason. But let's say we're able to resolve that, and then we're able to go into this third phase, which is when we can have sort of departments, so teams that are led by executives who are able to sort of manage all of that, and so take again sort of remove you further as a bottleneck in that. So that means we don't have to go down that death phase. We can try to work out something that can evolve us into that next part. But if we fail to do that, this is essentially what that looks like. So this is exactly the same example as we had before. So imagine you're right at the start. For the first time, you're hiring someone to take on some of your load, whether that's sales or somewhere else. Let's say you've evolved that into phase two, where you start having teams that work on specific things. But you might hit a snag because 50% of those first hires that you make, they fail. They either not good cultural fits and you need to let them go or manage them out, or they're not performing, or they quit, or something like that. And at this point, the founders then need to step back in and right the ship. And in doing that, we take our eye off the ball of all the other parts of the business, and we start sliding down that death phase that's in there. But then, we right the ship, so we're back into this third phase now. We replace the hires that didn't work out. We progress the ones that did, and now things are going again. But what we see is we're in a position now where we end up with, we're not as far along as we would have liked, so we lost time there, and we're in a position where we're not, we don't have the sort of capacity or the ability to perform at the level that we need to at this current point in time. So again, we can evolve through these different phases, but we can still hit a snag along the way. Just sort of means that we don't get to where we need to be as quickly. So it's important to think about how we link these phases as well, and making sure that we're always keeping an eye on those four different limits to growth. So just before we move into sort of the back end of this, does anyone have any comments or anything they want me to clarify? Otherwise, we'll spend more time on just talking about what you can do from here. I think we're looking good. Okay, cool. Okay, so then let's talk about maybe what you can do from here. And I guess a big thing to take away, if you take away anything from this, is understanding that hitting a limit to growth is completely natural. That's absolutely accepted. There's no such thing as this theoretical infinite growth. It doesn't exist. So what we need to do is understand, okay, what are those limits, and how can we plan for them, and how can we sort of overcome them? And across those four areas, they tend to look like these are the types of plans, or these are the types of things that you can think about in order to understand where they are. So if we start with the talent side, we can look into things like our talent pipeline, and we can work out how are we constantly sourcing candidates. So we're not just going out to the market to find new candidates when we absolutely desperately need them. How can we develop a pipeline so people are ready there when we can call on them. Think about and be intentional about a development plan for them. So think about, okay, if we've got staff coming in, how do we develop them and how do we help them grow with our company? Because if we don't do that, that means that we need to hire for that level above them, and we're back at square one in terms of the talent pipeline bit again. And then thinking about a compensation plan, so both financially, so are we paying them on market or how are they remunerated, but also non-financially. And I think the sort of generations that are coming through the workforce now are really motivated by things outside of just money. Like there's other parts of the business that are really important to them as well. So thinking about those four things, thinking about the plan for when we can pull talent in, how we develop them, how we compensate them, and sort of how we feed the rest of the business with this. So that then takes us directly down into finance, and unsurprisingly, having a cash flow forecast, and thinking about those plans is really important. But you can see how difficult a job this is because there's demands from every part of the business. There's people in HR saying we want to hire these people, product, or whoever's involved in sort of like delivering the end service, wants more investment. Sales wants more leads, they want more salespeople. So finding something that can kind of balance all of those needs and then forecast it out in a way that gives you a bit of slack, so that you're not absolutely just going over the red the whole time. Having some KPIs that are both financial and non-financial, I think, is really important. So clearly when we do things, we build the product. Sometimes it takes a really long time to get payback on that. So thinking about ways and rules of thumb, we might say, we're going to put a certain percentage back into developing what we do, making sure we're keeping ahead of the curve there. And as long as we see certain metrics come back from that, we're happy with that investment. And then a cash policy that essentially means that is obsessed with getting cash in the business as quickly as possible. And if we have something to spend it on, that will grow us spending it as quickly as possible. And this is really what a good financial controller will help you with. But even lacking one, there's lots of sort of practical things that you can do at this stage as well. Going up into sales. So these are sort of more software terms, but I think they're broadly applicable. Sort of go-to-market plan, or you can think about even this as a business plan that sort of steps out. Okay, how do we generate new business? How do we stay top of mind for these customers? Who are we targeting? Why are we targeting them? Why are we good? What are our competitors good at? And then keeping on top of that. So refreshing that maybe once every 6 months or 12 months, depending on the industry, so that you're very focused on, okay, if we want to grow, we know we need to add more value to certain segments in our market, and sort of taking that very seriously. Developing playbooks. So in your industry, Tom, that might just look like standard operating procedures. Are we upselling? Are we doing all these sorts of things that we know we need to do? From a consulting or a software point of view, it's basically, do we have best practice in here so that when we get new salespeople into the business, they're performing at a really high level very quickly? And are we sort of sharing that best practice across the team and updating that? And then doing our market analysis. And we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but it is just sort of staying abreast of the market, understanding where that curve is, trying to keep us ahead of that curve, and trying to understand what our competitors are doing as well, and making sure we keep that positioning against them. And then a bit at the bottom, product. There's really only sort of two, I think, important bits for this, and just sort of keep you off the on the straight and narrow, and that's having some sort of feedback process, both internally and externally. So making sure internal teams, salespeople on the front line, and other people sort of feeding back, whoever's talking to customers, are we doing a good job? Is the product thrilling people? Do we have product market fit there? And then some sort of product roadmap that says, where do we want to go? What do we want to develop? What do we want to build? What sort of capabilities do we want to have? All those sorts of things. The roadmap can change, and it's right to change. That's completely fine. But that is very helpful for the finance team as well, to know that, okay, next year we really want to launch a new menu somewhere, or we want to have a new product, or we want to have a new capability. Let's factor that into our cash flow so we can understand that. And that way, both the product team and the HR or talent team aren't sort of logging, so butting heads there at that point down the line. So those are some things that you can think about, and I think even just taking one or two of those to really sort of alleviate some of the pinch points could be super helpful and something to think about. But that is essentially what I had for you today. So going over, what are some models that we have to think about growth? What are the limits to growth, and how to think about kind of evolving through them? But I think one of the really cool parts about this is, and we can go through it, is just hear about some of your challenges, some of the things that you're facing, whether there's anything that you thought from this presentation that you thought you might be able to, you want to unpack on more. But keen to throw it over to you and hear from you guys.